Join us today. Welcome everybody. Welcome back to our second program with Julie Sweetland from Frameworks. I'm Mary McClelland with the Environmental Law and Policy Center. I'm here with a bunch of my fellow ComNet leadership team folks. Happy to have you back. I'm really just going to pass it over to Julie. We had a fantastic program, kind of Frameworks 101, if you will, that we did a few weeks ago that we recorded and sent out to everybody. And we're going to record this one and send it out to folks as well. And today we're going to be talking about communications traps. And Julie has some, I know, really actionable, really good research for how us as communicators can really get our message out most effectively. So I'm really going to pass over to Julie. Before I do that, I just want to say we will be the ComNet Chicago team, as the world is starting to open up just a little bit. We are actually going to try to plan an in-person gathering sometime this summer, outside, distance, whatever we need to do, but we are more than floating heads, and it'd be really nice to see folks in person. And so our friend Jay Chinesky's going to organize that, and we're going to get out more information about that soon. And if you have ideas for it, please share them with us. And if you could, please, while we turn it over to Julie, put your name and where you work and in the chat so we can kind of see who's around today. And with that, I'm going to pass it on over to Julie. Thank you for being with us again. This is good stuff.
Thank you so much for having me. I had such a great time last time. It was a great conversation. And so thank you all for joining today. This is one of my favorite talks to give. It's just really, it's kind of fun. So I hope you all enjoy it. As we get started, I just want to invite you all to make liberal use of the chat function today. I see people coming in with introductions, which is great, but as I'm going along, if you've got a question or a comment, feel free to put it in as it occurs to you. I can stop, at intervals and see if we can address them, but even if I keep going, we'll then have some things teed up for our discussion at the end. As mentioned, I'm here from the Frameworks Institute. If you don't know us, we're a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. We work nationally and internationally. We're a group of social scientists who bring our different disciplines together to examine the communications aspects of different social issues. And our mission is to help folks like you with your mission through the power of framing. And we believe that if the nonprofit sector has greater capacity to lead productive public conversations on social and scientific issues, society will go better. Our theory of change is that frames, kind of meta narratives or overarching understandings of something, or just the way we talk about things, can drive broad social change. If we as change makers change what we say or use really effective communications, that changes what people hear, the surround sound on the issue, the public discourse on the issue. And that is really important because the number one, not the only, but the number one predictor of what people will believe is the number of times they have heard it. And so, us organizing our communications in effective ways together is really important. We can shift public thinking. And if we can shift public thinking and build cultivate public sentiment and will for better policy, that means, that's an important input into the policy making process, which can be big P policy legislation, but really policy is any group, anytime a group decides to act or not to act. So at the institutional, community, local level, all throughout. And if this is our theory of change, we believe it's really important to get that first circle right? If what we say affects what people hear, how they think, and what we end up doing as a group, it's really important that we select, and are mindful and intentional about what it is we put out into public discourse. And so my theme today is the idea of traps, that there are entirely plausible ways of framing things that seem logical, seem like they should work, sound good to us. But upon investigation, they turn out to either fall flat, have very little effect, or perhaps a backfire effect, doing more harm than good, sending people in the opposite direction. So I've got a set of 5 traps today that aren't issue specific, but cut across lots of social issues, things that we have seen come up time and time again in the research that we've done across issues. We've been doing this work for 20 years now. on everything from early childhood to human services to housing, poverty, climate change, nuclear disarmament, fun stuff like that. So we're just pulling from that today. The traps I'm going to go through are to watch out for guesswork, myth busting, misplaced compassion, naked numbers, and having your message have all urgency and no efficacy. All right, number one, guesswork. Often, especially if you're a communications professional, you can be particularly vulnerable. Wait, am I not sharing my screen?
Julie, I was just thinking, it doesn't look like your slides are up. We might need to make you a co-host. Are you able to share your screen?
I'm so sorry. I thought I was sharing my screen.
There we go.
Oops. Well,
Got
here's
it.
one. Well,
No
I won't
problem.
go through all that, but I will show you. Let's see. I'll start with this one. You know what is a communication trap? Zoom is a communication trap. All right.
That's true.
Play slideshow in window. I do want to show you the scary communication trap now. Here we go. Boom. That got scary.
Got it.
All right. And the traps we're going to watch out for today. I'm glad I caught that then. None of the rest of those visuals were really essential. But traps to watch out for: guesswork, myth busting, misplaced compassion, naked numbers, and all urgency but no efficacy. All right, number one, guesswork. We as communications professionals can be particularly prone to this, where what has worked for us in the past or what we have absorbed from marketing and communications for consumer products or from the political discourse doesn't always work for issue-based, issue pushes and issue-based, cause-based communications. And so our motto here is to know before you go, because many times we have seen that guesswork falls flat or sends people in the wrong direction. Here's one example. We ran, in our work on aging, we ran an experiment exploring the public's associations with a few common reference terms for older adults. So we were about to run a major survey, and we wanted to make sure that the word we used, the name we used to refer to people in later life, wasn't skewing the results, right? So we needed to kind of do a pilot and figure out what was the best term to use. And what we did was we set up a scale. We gave people the common terms, so senior citizen, elderly, older adults, and older people. And we asked them to put in, on a scale of 1 to 5, how competent they thought these people were, and also had some free flowing, like a free response text there. And here's what we saw. We saw that senior, elderly, and senior citizen were rated as much less competent, and that the most competent was older adult. On the least competent side of the scale, we saw people put in words like frail, dependent, physically ill, mobility issues, can't use a cell phone. And on the right side of the scale, on the competent, is more like self-sufficient, employed, things like that. So from this set of words, and just this set of data, you might think that older adults, is better. It's clear that senior and elderly are not, super helpful terms. So we asked a second question, which is, how old do you think these people are? And here's the results that we got. Ranging from as young as 54 to as old as 69. So first of all, you can see that the age tracks perfectly, right, with the perceived competence. The older people imagine with that word, the least competent that they think less competent they think people are. But the range for older adult was really interesting. We had people putting in numbers as low as 30. So the mean was 54, but people were putting in answers like 30, 32, things like that. And we thought about it, it made sense. If younger adults are in their 20s, well, then older adults are in their 30s. So our recommendation, we wouldn't have known that, right? We wouldn't have known that association if we hadn't asked, if we had just guessed. And so our recommendation to the field that's countering ageism is to use the term older person or older people, because it cues both over age 60, which is the group this field wants to bring attention to, and competent, wise, and that sort of thing. It doesn't lead to more paternalistic policies. So even just taking a moment to think about the words you're using to refer to the group that you're working in service of or advocating for can be really important. Another example of how guesswork doesn't work, we were doing research with a set of scientists in Australia who were doing research on the science of parenting. What were the kinds of interactions that parents, when parents and children have these kinds of interactions, outcomes improve for children. And they talked about this as the science of effective parenting. When we tested just that term, we found that if we said there's a science of effective parenting, support for that issue, support for research on that issue, support for sharing that research dropped by 6% from the control group, from the baseline. Whereas if we talked about the science of showing what children need and how parents can interact in ways that fulfill those needs, that led to a big boost in that issue. In terms of this bar graph is showing the level of support for parenting science and research. So in hindsight, that's can be a little obvious, right? Because thanks for your unsolicited parenting advice. I said no parent ever. And so saying there's a science of effective parenting, we can see in hindsight how that might backfire or have an unintended implication. But from the point of view of this group, right, they are scientists investigating parenting, right? And so just the word that comes very naturally to them, had a very different kind of connotation for the public. So to avoid this trap of guesswork, it's a simple step of just reminding yourself constantly and your colleagues that we are not our audience. The ticket that got us into the dance might not be the one that gets other people into the dance. The language that we use kind of internally, right? The expert to expert language doesn't translate necessarily readily to the public. And to make a decision about which terms will carry and which won't, it's important to look to research that's already available. So this will be my first but not my last plug for our resources. We do all of our research and kind of in service of the field and make it freely available as a gift to the field. And so you can often find resources that have dug into this, and particularly the culturals models research that we offer, where you can kind of see the mindsets and the things that people have, and you don't want to activate those. That's one way that it's much more generative than just looking at have they tested this term. But if I know there's a sense of, if I know a model is that young adults or adolescents are wild and out of control and dangerous, I want to avoid activating that. So I want to avoid using terms like juvenile offender and kids in trouble and things like that. Like it would let you kind of see where those words can go wrong. And if you're ever doing some major work, consider conducting and commissioning research. It just you can do that pretty easily through things like Amazon MTurk and other tools that you can use on your own. And there are lots of folks, as you guys know, who can do this work, but it's more important than sometimes we give it credit for. Second trap, myth busting. So any of us who work on social issues can intuitively see and name and talk about misconceptions on our issues that get in the way of effective policy and programs. And that makes sense that we all know that we're all working on issues where there are a lot of misconceptions. If we are, doing social change work by that very nature, that's countercultural work. And so the culture must have some ideas that are holding that problem in place. And so it often, nonprofit communicators will often try to directly counter and dispel those myths and misconceptions that we know attend on our issue. As it turns out, this doesn't work. This is a screenshot or an image of a flyer that the CDC put out 15 years ago now. And by showing this example and talking about the study of this, I am not picking on the CDC. First of all, they are very generous funders of the Frameworks Institute. Second of all, everybody does this. I've yet to encounter a field that doesn't have, some of this myth fact kind of organization or even a particular sheet like this. Everyone does this, and so some researchers at the University of Michigan decided to investigate the effects of this type of communication. So they designed an experiment where they gave folks, this flyer that has a series of myths and facts. So myth, the flu shot can cause the flu. Fact, the flu shot does not cause the flu, so on and so forth. So they gave people this flyer, let them hold it and read it as long as they wanted to. Whenever they were done, they took it away and they gave them a quiz on just these 6 things and asked which was true, which was false. And the study showed that, first of all, people misremembered the myths as true. They followed up with them a few days later and they found out that it got worse over time. The level of misconception increased the further they got away from the communication. And thirdly, and most terrifyingly for those of us who have put our logo on something like this, people attributed the false information to the CDC. So they remembered the trusted messenger. No, this is the nation's, public health watchdog. But I read from them, if I hadn't gotten the flu vaccine by December, don't bother. So why is this? Okay, this is not about the CDC as a messenger. The study was done in 2005. This has nothing to do with kind of the current politicization or context. It's not because people are willfully stupid. It is because of the way the mind works. Myths are myths precisely because people have heard them so many times. They have a cognitive neural reality in the mind. There's a little neural circuit that holds that information in place and is ready to be pulled up whenever the mind encounters something related to that topic. And so by repeating the myth, we've activated that neural circuit, given it another repetition, strengthened it, and then expected our one expression of our sad blue fact to overcome a lifetime of experience and expectation. That's not going to work. So that was a lot of social science and neuroscience for the simple framing lesson, which is never remind people of something you wish they would forget. Another version of this that has been done more on a more kind of political topic was looking at how this intersects, how myth busting intersects with partisan thinking and political ideology. So in this study, the researchers, and this is not our research, tested 2 messages. One was a message, and this is during the Bush administration, that had like a newspaper article that you can see here, which made the assertion that tax cuts increase revenues, right? Increase revenues to the treasurer through this kind of job creation sort of thing. But it just made the case and it gave the numbers. And then there was a second message that was tested, which was this first one plus this layer, right, with fact-based correction. So with the revenue increases, revenues in 2005 will remain well below previous projections. And in fact, the last time we did this, we had an unprecedented 3-year decline. So correcting, right, that fact. Here's what we found. This experiment that compared, kind of your side message versus your side plus the other side, the fact-checked version, found that, of course, pre-existing political identity mattered. So conservatives, people who identified as conservatives, were more likely than people who said they were liberals to agree, right, with the first message that tax cuts actually increase revenue. But the framing mattered too. So the conservatives that were exposed to the correction became twice as likely to believe, right? Twice as likely to believe the opposite of the correction, right? They were like, no, if the people who received no corrections thought through it for themselves and thought, how does that make sense? The people who had gotten the fact checking version said, well, I want to play with my team, right? I'm going to go with what my team says. And so some rebutting in a partisan context can reinforce people's tendency to want to stick with their side rather than engage in the content itself. So that's another reason why myth busting is not always, doesn't work always plausibly or logically. So to avoid this trap, in general, advance your affirmative case. And this is harder than it sounds for those of us that are working on pressing social issues. We are often in this work because we want to change something, fix something, defeat the problem. And so we often organize our communications as if they are an argument, right, with that with that reality or with that misconception. But if we just advance our affirmative case, say what is true, why it should work, why we should do this, why it matters, who's responsible, what we can do about it, and rather than trying to, again, organize everything as if it's a rebuttal of the other side, that helps a lot. In general, remembering that the best way to kill off a myth is to starve it of attention, not to beat it over the head with facts. But if it, and in limited, in some circumstances, there sometimes truly is a need to correct misinformation. In those cases, it's important to emphasize what is true, state it clearly, elaborate on it, give an example or a support as to why it's true. And then only after you have really firmly planted that sense, of what you do want people to take away, you can say, therefore it's a harmful myth that that abuse is worse than neglect, right? Or something like that. You can kill off the myth in a statement like that. If possible, and there are times it's helpful. There's research showing that it's helpful to point out the source of misinformation, so that that's something that came from Russian bots. Is something you might have heard recently somewhere. But to do that in measured tones, if you really say it's those folks this is the source of the myth, and that's why they're saying it, and it's poorly motivated and those sorts of things, you're likely to activate that my side bias rather than getting that persuadable middle. All right, I'm just take a quick second and try to pop into the chat to see if anything has come up there. Let's see. All of my little things are not coming up, so I'm going to keep moving. Sorry. Misplaced compassion. I talked about, kind of don't argue. Some people say, well, all right, well, what I'm going to do? Of course, I don't want to be argumentative. I'm going to go for a different type of emotional appeal and connect people kind of in a more compassionate and empathetic way, draw on personal stories that really illustrate the issue. We have found time and again that type of appeal doesn't work the way we might think. So here's an example of a study that we conducted in Alberta, Canada, maybe 8 or 9 years ago now. We were looking for we were testing different ways of building support for really progressive and forward-thinking approaches to treating addiction. So not kind of a single method, get to a meeting or even get medically assisted treatment, but a really integrated kind of process that involves peer support, professional counseling, medically assisted treatment where possible, longer term multimodal, so not just in the moment of crisis, but really looking at engaging the family. So a really kind of robust and thoughtful approach to addressing addiction. And we tested, 3 different messages or values frames that for their ability to move people to support those kinds of policies and funding for them. And so the 0 line here is the baseline, the control group that got no message. And you'll see, if it goes up, that means people are more supportive for those policies. If it goes down, less supportive for those policies. All right, so the first message we tested was ingenuity. That if we can be clever, resourceful, take a new, fresh approach to longstanding problems, and that worked pretty well. 3.5% bump, which is a decent amount of shift for this type of micro dose experiment. We then tested another message, interdependence. We're all woven together in a fabric of society. What affects one of us directly affects all of us indirectly. And this is, we're all in this together. And because they're Canadians, they fell for it, and it was about 6% bump. So that was great. And then we tested a third message, empathy. Any one of us this could happen to any of this. It could be your, mother, brother, sister, hockey coach. We really need to think about, walk a mile in these folks' shoes, be compassionate in our response. And that had the exact opposite effect of what was needed, what was wanted. So a couple of things. Back to the guesswork point, guess which one of these the group, the advocacy field had sat and pulled together and said, you know what, we need to bring this issue out. What are we going to do as a campaign? they had actually all sat down and intentionally chosen empathy as their meta frame and had a whole storytelling campaign and that sort of thing. My second point here, though, is that it's not that people can't be empathetic. The interdependence message got them to support a very compassionate approach to the policy issue. But a direct appeal to compassion, with our interpretation as to why this matters, is if you focus people on the individual, you focus people on the individual. And that brings up this whole story of personal responsibility, personal choice that attends to this issue, but also lots of social change issues. And so that actually led people to think, well, if they're doing that, like, why should my funding go to that and that sort of thing? Whereas the broader social frame, social context frame was much more effective in getting people to think about why to support this issue and to support a robust approach. So in that experience, you see this, an appeal to empathy made Canadians less likely to support funding for treatment with people with addictions. Similarly, I could show you more bar graphs, but I decided to spare you. An appeal to compassion had no effect on the public support for human services, whereas an appeal to human potential did. An appeal to vulnerability made Americans less likely to support funding for kids, whereas an appeal to ingenuity did lead to that support. So let me show you another example of that, especially on that human services point. We did test it experimentally, but we did a field experiment in partnership with Rising Ground, a nonprofit, a major nonprofit, fairly large nonprofit in New York. And they were running a donor acquisition campaign. So they had 20,000 letter names. They randomized them. They bought the names from different lists. And these were people who had previously contributed to some sort of social service organization, but had not contributed to Rising Ground in the past. They had 20,000 names. They randomized them, and we sent 10,000 people a letter that was based on compassion. So talking about how much, we help each other, it's very charity, how much we care for each other, we offer help, we offer assistance in times of need, we lend a helping hand. It's a very compassionate approach. So lots of cues for that kind of compassion and empathy kind of framing. It went on to tell a story of Jewel, a 2-year-old that came into their care as her mother was struggling with addiction, and they really helped and showed a lot of love and got that family back together. And happy and thriving. We then sent the other 10,000 folks randomly selected from this, pool, a donor appeal that was grounded in the messaging we had tested that was much more about the human potential and building shared well-being. So not an empathy or compassion approach, more of a aspirational and social framework kind of approach. So same kind of letter, they were the same length, etc. But instead of helping, written a rich history of New Yorkers helping each other, we have helped to build well-being in New York, creating a more vibrant and thriving community. We've worked lots of ways not to help people rise above their challenges, but we've worked to bring out their potential. So on and so forth. The story of Jules' family was really one about a family that got hit by one of life's storms, and we worked to shore up that foundation with counseling and support, same kinds of details. And once they were stabilized, right, they were able to really experience well-being as a family. So a little bit less of the heartstrings and more of the, it takes a team to do this work. And that was the metaphor we had tested, just as a house is never built by a single individual. No one builds well-being alone. So across these 20,000 folks, the reframed donor appeal got twice as many responses. So more people actually, responded to this direct mail appeal, and they were much more likely to include larger gifts of $100 or more than the folks who did respond to the original donor appeal. So more donors and higher average donations for this. And so even in the context where we have been accustomed to relying on charity and compassion, there's evidence that suggests that again, something more aspirational and more structural can be more effective even in kind of these fundraising types of settings. So to avoid the compassion trap, we will all at points as a communicator feel the need to get them to care. I would counsel you to avoid direct appeals to compassion, charity, or especially vulnerability. Instead, look to research to select a values frame that resonates more broadly, that doesn't hyper focus on the individual or ask only for an individual response from your audience, right? We want something that's more of a civic response. And use personal stories as seasoning for a contextual narrative, not the main ingredient. So, another way that we do compassion appeals is through the individual stories of program beneficiaries, people with lived experience, et cetera. And we have found that those often are traps and don't work as well as using a personal story as in a larger narrative. I want to show you a video that illustrates as an explainer video. It's about, I don't know, it's a little long. It's like 2.5 minutes long, I think. There's a shorter version of it, but I wanted to show you this full narrative arc. This is from the National Center on Elder Abuse, that's looking to, that's an issue that's really ripe for using those personal stories, but that we worked with this group to tell a more contextual story. I'm actually not sure I hit that right button, the share my sound thing. So let me do that again. Share sound, do this, do that. All right. Watch this video, which puts the personal story of an individual in a larger narrative.
A just society works to make sure everyone is free from the threat of abuse at every stage of life. To live up to our ideal of justice for all, we need to work to address the social issue of elder abuse. It's important to understand what creates the risk of experiencing abuse or neglect as we age. A strong and just society is like a structure, supported by many beams. We need strong beams that are frequently maintained. You can think of these beams as the policies and programs that reinforce the relationships and resources needed for health, happiness, and safety. When those support beams are missing or not maintained, the structure is weaker and may not meet our expectations that people are able to live free from maltreatment. The first and most important step to prevent elder abuse is to reduce social isolation. George, age 77, reminds us why this is important. George spends most of his time at home alone since his wife died. His daughter lives too far away to visit regularly, and his neighborhood lacks reliable public transit and many age-friendly civic spaces. Fewer social interactions mean fewer opportunities for walking, talking, and laughing. And with these normal, healthy experiences missing, George's physical, cognitive, and emotional health have gotten worse. His daughter does not know what she can do or where she can turn for help. Without the structure of support, it's easy to see how if George encountered an unsafe situation, the problem might go unnoticed. George's story of social isolation is not uncommon. With millions of our fellow Americans living in similar situations, it's fair to say that our nation's social structure needs repair. Just as one beam alone can't support a building, individuals and family members alone can't single-handedly manage the problem of social isolation and the corresponding risk of maltreatment. The good news is that there are many ways to strengthen our social supports through policies, services, and programs that keep us integrated in our communities as we age. We can design and equip community centers to work as intergenerational spaces that allow older people to build relationships and participate in the work, play, and life of our neighborhoods. We can think about the role of transportation and reducing social isolation and adjust systems so that we can all continue to move throughout our communities as we age. We can figure out new and better ways to arrange and coordinate the teams, agencies, and programs that specifically work with older people. We can develop programs to educate families and professionals who work with older adults to understand the importance of preventing isolation, how to spot the warning signs of maltreatment, and what to do to address abuse or neglect. By doing all we can to strengthen the social support structure, we can reduce social isolation, protect communities and families against elder abuse, and build a nation that lives up to our promise of justice for all. Learn more and see how you can get involved in preventing elder abuse and promoting greater justice for older people at ncea.acl.gov.
Okay, I'll pause there for a second and just ask for any observations or comments. I mean, I know this is a lengthier communication. It was designed for a particular purpose. But where do you see the difference between something that's just using the personal story as a vehicle versus this, which is a little broader? I just would love to hear what you guys noticed in that, the framing of this.
I thought that was a really strong video. The kind of societal impact piece. I don't, just even the visuals of the I don't know, scale or whatever you want to call that, with the pillars, and using George as an example of how, you know, as a I don't know, I'm not talking very clearly, but I really like that. It's a totally different frame versus just George is stuck at home and can't, you know, is ripe for abuse, but the system around him, it's that collective good kind of thing.
Yeah, it's not poor George, right? It's hey, we are creating a system in which George is happening, right? And we can also create a system in which George is okay. So great. Other observations, comments? Yeah. All right, so I'm going to pause and just answer. Let me show you the results of this, and then I'll come back to your question, Lisa. So when we tested this, not that video, but the framing and messaging that led to the creation of that video, here's what we saw. If we just told the story of George, it had very little effect on a couple things, whether or not people felt we could do something as a society, so their collective efficacy. They might say, yeah, oh my God, people did say it's a problem. People agreed that it was a problem, but when it came around to what to do about the problem, it had very little effect on people's sense that we could do something. It's kind of like George's kid needs to move back home when that's the solution. It's not and so the sense of collective efficacy and the sense of policy support was very low. When we told the individual story nested in the broader narrative, like what you just saw, there was a much greater sense that this was an issue that society could tackle. That there was something, if we did something, right, it would make a difference. And people were much more supportive of specific policies that this field wanted to address. So I'm going to pause and just pop into the chat here. Lisa's asked a good question about why empathy and compassion approach tends to fail. What frame is it bumping up against? I think it's bumping up mostly against the myth of the rugged individual, and the myth of personal, you know, the kind of the myth of individualism, or the mental model of individualism, that the causes and consequences of problems, right, are people's own choices. And so when we ask for empathy, some people will respond with empathy, but just as many, if not more, particularly in America, where this natural human cognitive tendency is reinforced daily with cultural reminders and cultural norms. If we ask for empathy, there's kind of the "you made your bed, you got to lie in it" response is readily available in America. And so that is an anti-compassion kind of model for sure. But I think that that's the main one. I think when we also layer in, depending on the individual we are highlighting, if we layer in difference, right, othering of some sort, any kind of groups that are seen as othering, that can also tap into kind of group anti-compassion stereotypes about groups that that lead us to that less compassionate place. All right, chapter number 4, naked numbers. Sometimes we have this kind of tacit, implicit formula in our mind as we are looking to use data to make a point. So we're going to start with our numbers. We're going to go down the hall to the person who's really good at data visualization and pretty them up with charts, graphs, tables, and more data. As we roll out communications, we like to add more data, like that study that came out last week that totally proves the point I've been trying to make all along. And then as we stack up, right, all of this evidence, we will achieve an epiphany for the public. And this is not the way the human mind works, right? Humans are not, our audiences are not looking at different social issues and keeping a tally of evidence that they've seen on one side or the other. And rather, they're taking cues from lots of things, and numbers may or may not be the thing that sways them. So let me show you some of that data. This is from a study that we did some time ago on how to boost support for comprehensive immigration reform. So we had a few different messages. One was economic growth facts that really just showed very clearly that the immigrants take jobs and that sort of thing is just not true. That really showing that more expansive and humane approach, of more expansive immigration policies lead to economic growth. The second set of messages that we tested were rights-based facts, so different ways that people seeking asylum or people looking to immigrate to the U.S. have their rights violated, the rights that people do have, human rights kinds of facts. And then the third was both facts from each of those types, but connected with a story that talked about how we need to ensure that America has shared prosperity. All of us, right, want to engage in this, and opening up to immigrants can boost the economy, same fact, and really live up to our ideals, as a democracy. So some of the rights-based facts. Here's what we found. The economic growth facts had led people in the wrong direction. The rights-based facts had some effect on wanting people to kind of fix legal immigration, but didn't do anything for folks who may be undocumented or even seeking asylum. But connecting those facts with a narrative was highly effective. So to a question that's come up in the chat, do these things work in all kinds of communications? I would say that the social media tile, right, that just has a statistic on it, and that's something we push out, that often I think we can see is going to have a backfire effect rather than something that kind of puts context around things. I don't mean to suggest that everything has to have a big long narrative. Everything doesn't need a 2.5 minute explainer. You can do that sort of thing in shorter formats, and I'll show you that in just a moment. The reason the numbers on their own don't do this is because people dress naked numbers in their own story. So here's an example. This is a social media tile that came out in relation. It's from Jamie Oliver. He did a documentary series on kind of how sugar is sugar is public enemy #1 sort of thing. And this was one of the ancillary communications they put out. This is in the UK. 26,000 primary age kids were admitted to hospital last year because of tooth decay caused by sugar. By some measures, this communication went really well. It got 712 retweets, 377 favorites. I think that's pretty great in terms of just reach and kind of engagement metrics. But let's look at the comments. 26,000 kids were admitted because of tooth decay caused by sugar. #1 comment, right underneath that spot where everyone's favoriting and retweeting, and neglectful parents, forgot that part, right? So people interpreting that through individual responsibility. Next one, from an uncharitable point of view. Second one is also responsibility, although it's a little nicer. Educate, drink water, take responsibility for your children's health. So a kind of education, like fix the person nicely, but still an individual response. Here, it's impossible to admit sugar. What can we do? So fatalism, right, is an easy response from naked numbers. The next one, I refuse to give my son drinks with sweeteners in them. So, if I've done the thing to protect me and mine, literally check, handled that social issue, right, with her little X mark. Here, next one, brush baby. We can help with the toothbrushing. Take a look. Link to buy cute baby toothbrushes. So a very consumerist type of response. Will the private sector, right? Can we just buy our way out of this problem? And then finally, the one person who responds with some kind of social, cultural, structural framework you know, well done, but good luck. I've worked in special care dental services for 27 years. We have a year waiting list. She wants to tell him good luck twice because she's so fatalistic, right? That we can have a public response to an issue that's presented in this big, you know, big scary number and also scary picture kind of way. So, you know, this is just one example, but I would say across the 400 studies we've done, you know, kind of looking at how people think about statistics on their own, they are very unproductive. So to avoid the naked number trap, it's always important, don't just say any number will do or the bigger number will do the trick. Always ask, what will that number do? Anticipate the kinds of misconceptions it can reinforce, particularly individualism, fatalism, and otherism. So it's important to always nest the narratives and nest the numbers in that narrative. Again, thinking of them as a seasoning, not the whole dish. And add language, add lots of cues to help people interpret what the numbers mean. I'm going to show you another example of how there was how simple example of how to add more cues for interpretation. So this is a very simple infographic that we were working with the state of Idaho, children's advocates looking for Medicaid expansion some time back. The original was on the left, where they had some statistics here, you know, elimination of count. And so I'll just give you a close read here. So the first thing we did, right to left, is change the title. So how do we interpret numbers? The title on the left, economic impact by fiscal year 2024, that tells me that this is information for experts. Whereas on the right side, the title is more plain language, and that tells me this is information for citizens, right? Information for everyone. We worked across this to think about what others might know, what non-experts might know or not know, how would they misunderstand this? So the elimination of county and state programs will provide lots of property tax savings. That, you know, I'm pretty good at pretending to be a policy wonk, although I'm not actually one. And I was like, but wait, aren't you trying to expand programs? Why are you eliminating them? The general sense was there's a lot of duplication. If we kind of go into the federal, you know, pool, then we can kind of not pay for stuff ourselves. And so that meant, well, okay, well, we don't want to talk about eliminating programs when we're trying to expand programs. Let's focus our resources, and that would help us save that money in state and local budgets. And we looked at the total savings number. That just didn't seem that impressive. And so we struck that number altogether and looked for something else. We looked at, you know, making the savings generating focus that with building our prosperity, expanding our workforce, right? Telling people what do these numbers mean, right? So we're going to be more focused, more prosperous, more jobs, and it has a health benefit. We ended up adding that in instead of the personal savings, which was A, a small number, and B, felt very individualistic, consumeristic to me. So lots of cues here for how to interpret these numbers. We're not just giving people the facts. We are giving them the facts. They are facts. They're accurate numbers, but cueing them, pointing them, giving them signposts to where we'd want them to go with those numbers. All right, fifth trap, and then we'll have time for a juicy discussion, is all urgency and no efficacy. If you are working on any pressing social issue, you know that there's a crisis. You just know you're there, you just really understand. But if we message with crisis, we all do it. And this steady drip, drip, drip of crisis messaging does not fill people with urgency and mobilization. Actually, what it does is it drains from the public's finite pool of worry. It leads to a sense of overwhelm more often than it leads to a sense of we need to get on top of this. And so it's important that we balance the urgency, which we need. We do need urgent action. We need to take action now to make things better, prevent worse outcomes. but we need to balance that with efficacy, the sense that there's something that we can do, and if we do it, it will make a difference. So if we look at the, how you could mix and match efficacy and urgency, if we start with low efficacy, not a lot we can do, and low urgency, not on the radar screen, that's kind of where most people are to begin with. So you don't want to do that. If we go to high urgency, crisis, 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 but don't turn up the efficacy, that leads to fear, fatalism, and overwhelm. If we go to a lot of efficacy, solutions within reach, solutions for days, but we haven't made it urgent, right? Then people think, okay, you guys got this, we don't need to mobilize. But if you can have a message with both high urgency, this action is needed now, and efficacy, and here's the action we should take, and it's doable, that's the kind of space you want to go to. So that's the way to avoid the all urgency trap. Another way, a more poetic and less emoji way to put this, is this beautiful quote from Frances Fox Piven in the classic work Poor People's Movement. For social change to occur, the social arrangements that we typically perceive as just, okay, and immutable, unchangeable, they must come to be seen as both unjust and mutable. As advocates, we are typically pretty good at the unjust part. The mutable part is where we need to balance things out. Here's an example of all urgency on the left and urgency plus efficacy on the right. So, and these are both actual communications. So secondhand smoke is super scary. It's got 7,000 chemicals, hundreds are toxic, 70 can cause cancer. We've known about this since 1964, but since then we've lost 2.5 million adults who died because they breathe secondhand smoke, and there is no risk-free level of exposure to secondhand smoke. So that is all urgency. And what that makes me want to do is tell my brother to quit smoking and don't let him in my house with his nasty cigarettes. I want to protect myself, right? I cocoon. But to get broader social buy-in and a more, again, mobilization for civic action, we need we need urgency and efficacy. So give me the urgency. There's no safe level of exposure to secondhand smoke. Now give me some efficacy. We need to make every workplace totally smoke-free with no exceptions. And you can learn more or sign on to or show up at a meeting. You can dial up the mobilization language as higher, but join us to make our city, smoke-free for people, even for people who work in bars and casinos. So even that mobilization language or that call to action has some efficacy cues in it. All right, that is what I have prepared to say. I want to open the floor for thoughts, reactions, and questions. I'm going to look at the chat and see what we can lift up there. Sorry, Mary, were you going to read me things from the chat at all? And then also...
No, go for it. There's a couple of things in there.
Okay. All right, Iris, good question. And everyone can see Iris's question there about the video not being as kind of emotional, right, or poignant that you have. So it is our observation and recommendation that hyper-emotional, it's our observation that hyper-emotional messages don't work in the way we expect. Perhaps close your slides, we're on screen. Good idea. Okay. Hyper-emotional messages often have a counterintuitive effect. That's why they are a trap. We have tested some things around narrative format. We often land, for those explainer types of videos, we do often land on composite character. So George is a composite character, right? Not kind of a real person. Obviously, you wouldn't want to do that for media advocacy or if you were doing, different formats work. But we find that for getting people to generalize from an individual case up to the issue, that sense that this is the animation and the generic character actually is a generalizing cue, right? It's baked into the frame in that way. depending on what you wanted to do, how quickly you needed action, right? You may want to use real people, but we have found that even in those instances, putting it in that structural context is different. So I've got another good example from another aging issue where there was one story that really focused in on a woman who was isolated, and going through her day and looking at what she does, throughout the day, she just rips up paper. She takes her junk mail and rips it into tiny, tiny shreds. And that's the way she keeps herself entertained. Versus another story with a neighbor that showed still isolation, but the reason for the isolation was this road that they had built in between like the community and the community center. And that person with mobility issues couldn't get over there, and there wasn't transportation. The response to the first one was people wanted to send her letters. The response to the second one was, can we fix the public transportation issue? So only the poignancy, you will get a response from the poignancy, but it is more likely to be an individual, let me reach out and help that person, rather than the broader social frame. So that's why we ease off the poignancy a little bit.
We're almost at time, so I feel like if there's one or two more questions, that's probably what we have time for. This has been fantastic. And people can feel free to come off of mute and ask verbally, or if you want to put questions in the chat.
So I just want to ask a question. Throughout your slides, first of all, thank you so much for the presentation. It is really incredible research you guys are doing. And I know that there isn't enough budget to research all of these issues in every context. So as somebody who this morning was looking at research done in Australia around acceptance of people with disabilities, and I was trying to extrapolate that to the US, and really unsure if I could use that data to inform our messaging. I saw that you used the Australian data for the aging study. How transferable are these things?
So so the Australian data was the parenting, you talk about effective parenting or what kids need. How transferable are they? So I intentionally pulled from a variety of national contexts today, because these things that are consistently traps are traps not because of the political context. They're traps because they activate built-in hardwired cognitive biases, right? So the fundamental attribution error, this is something that's built into human evolution. We attribute outcomes to personal activity, right? Without some cues to not do that. That's super activated in American culture, as I already said. And that's why empathy is a trap if your goal is to get people to think structurally and do social change, right? And so a lot of these that I mentioned here, I was trying to show data from different studies to really illustrate the fact that these are things that you can consistently walk into. I wouldn't know if the word seniors or senior citizens has the same kind of paternalistic, frail connotations in Australia. I literally have no idea. So it kind of depends on what level you're asking about.
Thanks.
Okay, on that note, being cognizant of time, it is 1 o'clock Central Time. So Julie, thank you. This was really helpful. For everybody, we have been recording this. We'll send it out to folks. Keep an eye out for future programs. We're gonna do something in person soon. But again, Julie, Frameworks Institute, go to the Frameworks Institute site. They've got incredible wealth of resources. They are fantastic. So thank you, and have a good day, everybody.
Bye for now.
Okay.